Imagine a list so powerful it survived empires. A list analyzed by Greek philosophers who believed human failure could be dissected like an equation. Feared by desert monks who thought every thought could corrupt the soul. Edited, expanded, trimmed, rewritten, condemned, resurrected, and redesigned for more than 1,000 years. A list that started with 8 items, then 7 plus 1, shifting every time the world changed. A list treated today as if it had fallen from the sky fully formed. Yet its earliest versions had different sins, different priorities, and sometimes different meanings entirely. Today, people call it the 7 deadly sins. But throughout history, there was nothing stable about it. In one era, pride was the queen of all faults. In another, it wasn't even counted. Sloth once meant a spiritual collapse. Gluttony included excessive talking. Lust was described as a distortion of judgment rather than a moral crime. And hidden inside all these contradictions lies a question almost nobody asks. If the sins change so dramatically from culture to culture, what exactly are we calling a sin? Because here is the part rarely mentioned in books, films, sermons, or memes. The list was never meant to stay the same. It was engineered, slowly, deliberately, to shape behavior, categorize emotions, and structure the invisible psychology of temptation. To understand it, we must leave behind the medieval artworks and the modern interpretations, and travel back to a world where this list did not exist yet. A world where Greek thinkers debated how to classify human impulses, where Roman rhetoricians constructed catalogs of vices to attack political opponents, where Jewish wisdom literature listed behaviors believed to mislead the soul, and where early Christian monks treated inner thoughts as the front line of spiritual warfare. Each generation added something new. Each tradition reshaped the list based on its fears, its philosophy, and its understanding of the human mind. And gradually, these scattered fragments solidified into a structure so iconic that it became embedded in Western imagination. But the version we know today is only the final draft of a manuscript rewritten for more than a millennium. A manuscript filled with missing pages, erased ideas, alternate arrangements, and meanings that vanished long before the list reached its modern form. This is the story of how a list became doctrine, how doctrine became culture, and how culture transformed 7 words into one of the most enduring moral frameworks of all time.
Before the 7 deadly sins became a polished list printed in textbooks and painted on cathedral walls, they existed as scattered ideas floating across civilizations. Each era shaped them according to its fears, its philosophy, and its vision of what corrupted the human soul. To trace this evolution, we must begin not with medieval theologians, but with a distant world where sin was not yet a category, and moral failure was described with the language of imbalance, excess, and distortion. In ancient Greece, Aristotle examined the human condition like an engineer studying the gears of a machine. He believed that every virtue existed between 2 extremes, and every extreme was a vice. Courage stood between recklessness and cowardice. Moderation sat between indulgence and insensibility. Even generosity lived between miserliness and prodigality. These early catalogs of vice helped Greeks understand not only behavior but persuasion. To praise someone, identify their virtues. To destroy someone, expose their vices. Political speeches depended on these lists. The Romans inherited this habit. Rhetoricians like Cicero and Horace crafted extensive maps of moral failure, naming everything from greed and envy to ambition, indulgence, and spiritual laziness. Their lists were not spiritual punishments, but social warnings, a guide to what weakens a leader, a family, or a city. Meanwhile, in the Jewish world, another tradition took shape. Texts like the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs described 7 spirits of deception trying to mislead humanity: pride, lust, gluttony, anger, boasting, lying, and injustice. These spiritual adversaries were not yet sins. They were forces that clouded judgment and disrupted covenant life. Yet their resemblance to later Christian lists is unmistakable. All these traditions, Greek, Roman, and Jewish, built foundations that Christianity would eventually inherit. But the turning point came in the deserts of Egypt, where early Christian monks treated inner thoughts as enemies. Their battle was not against armies or nations, but against impulses that rose inside the mind. One of these monks, Evagrius Ponticus, created what might be the first true ancestor of the 7 deadly sins. But his list wasn't a list of sins. It wasn't even a list of 7. Evagrius spoke of 8 evil thoughts, logismoi, the psychological roots from which sinful actions emerge: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, vainglory, and pride. These thoughts were not moral crimes. They were temptations that attacked the mind, shadows that grew stronger when entertained. Acedia, often mistranslated as sloth, meant spiritual restlessness, an internal collapse that made monks abandon their duties. Sadness referred to a crippling melancholy tied to regret for choosing the monastic life. In Evagrius's world, the battlefield was interior, and the weapons were discipline, awareness, and prayer. Centuries later, another monk, John Cassian, carried Evagrius's ideas to the Latin-speaking West, where they began to spread through monastic communities. By the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great reorganized these concepts into a more compact framework. He merged sadness and acedia, elevated envy into the list, and created the first recognizable version of what the world now calls the 7 deadly sins. But the transformation wasn't over. In the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas reinterpreted the list again, and the shift was dramatic. Aquinas distinguished vanity from pride and placed pride above the others, calling it the queen of all sins, the mother of rebellion. His system turned 7 sins into 7 trunk roots of vice, with pride as the invisible root feeding all of them. The structure was becoming formal, architectural. The list we know today was finally approaching its canonical shape. Yet even then, the list remained fluid. Different theologians adjusted the meanings. The border between lust and gluttony shifted. The nuances of greed changed depending on economic conditions. Acedia continued to oscillate between sadness, depression, and spiritual inertia. By the late Middle Ages, the 7 deadly sins became a cultural symbol. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch turned them into visual universes. Poets like Dante structured entire afterlives around them. Storytellers and preachers used them to explain human suffering, moral corruption, and the cosmic struggle between virtue and decay. The list had finally crystallized, not because it was divinely fixed, but because it had become culturally irresistible. As the list of sins traveled across centuries, languages, and empires, it didn't simply grow, it mutated. Gregory the Great compressed 8 vices into 7. Aquinas elevated pride so dramatically that it became a category above the categories, the mother of all sins. Medieval monks debated whether sloth was sadness, despair, boredom, apathy, or all of them at once. And artists, theologians, and preachers reshaped the list every time it crossed a border. But here's the part almost no one realizes. The 7 deadly sins were never a single perfect system. They were a moving target, a moral technology that every generation adjusted to fit its fears, its culture, its spiritual questions. In one region, anger was the central danger. In another, greed became the defining threat. Some teachers insisted envy was the deadliest. Others believed gluttony was not about food at all, but about any hunger for excess, including talking too much, resting too much, or seeking too much attention. Even the word lust once described a disturbance of the mind, not a moral crime. And yet, despite all this shifting, one pattern remained unbroken. Every era tried to use these sins to explain why humans fail and how humans might change. And that's where the story turns. Because from this point forward, the list becomes stranger, more psychological, more symbolic, and far more dramatic than most people expect. The next chapters reveal why monks feared acedia more than demons, how one translation error may have permanently altered the entire list, why sadness almost became an official deadly sin, how ancient Jewish literature predicted 5 of the 7 sins centuries before Christianity, and how Renaissance painters hid theological arguments inside their artwork. This isn't just the evolution of a list, it's the evolution of the human struggle itself. And the curiosities only get bigger from here. Prepare for the part of the story that almost no documentary ever tells. As the list of sins traveled across centuries, languages, and empires, it didn't simply grow, it mutated. Gregory the Great compressed 8 vices into 7. Aquinas elevated pride so dramatically that it became a category above the categories, the mother of all sins. Medieval monks debated whether sloth was sadness, despair, boredom, apathy, or all of them at once. And artists, theologians, and preachers reshaped the list every time it crossed the border. But here's the part almost no one realizes. The 7 deadly sins were never a single, perfect system. They were a moving target, a moral technology that every generation adjusted to fit its fears, its culture, its spiritual questions. In one region, anger was the central danger. In another, greed became the defining threat. Some teachers insisted envy was the deadliest. Others believed gluttony was not about food at all, but about any hunger for excess, including talking too much, resting too much, or seeking too much attention. Even the word lust once described a disturbance of the mind, not a moral crime. And yet, despite all this shifting, one pattern remained unbroken. Every era tried to use these sins to explain why humans fail and how humans might change. And that's where the story turns. Because from this point forward, the list becomes stranger, more psychological, more symbolic, and far more dramatic than most people expect. The next chapters reveal why monks feared acedia more than demons, how one translation error may have permanently altered the entire list, why sadness almost became an official deadly sin, how ancient. The deeper you go into the history of the 7 deadly sins, the more the ground shifts beneath your feet. Because just when the list seems stable, consistent, final, the historical record reveals another twist, another revision, another forgotten layer. One of the most puzzling questions is this: why 7? Ancient writers rarely agreed on the number. Evagrius had 8. Cassian kept 8. Gregory insisted on 7. Aquinas separated pride so dramatically that the structure became 7 plus 1. Some monastic orders use 6, others use 9. Medieval manuscripts record entire debates over whether wrath and sadness were actually 2 aspects of the same vice, or whether acedia should be split into despair and diversion. Even in the Renaissance, moralists questioned whether the list needed expansion to include new temptations emerging from commerce, urban life, and political ambition. Another question lingers: why did the 7 deadly sins survive when so many competing lists vanished? Greek moralists produced dozens of classifications of vice. Roman rhetoricians created entire catalogs of character flaws. Jewish wisdom literature offered structured lists of spiritual dangers. Early Christian writings warned about errors, temptations, passions, and disorders of the heart. Yet only one system, the sevenfold structure, endured. Not because it was universal, not because it was final,